In this learning block, we're going to look at SQL, JDBC, Java Database Connectivity, and JSF. You should already have seen the videos about SQL in Java and how to connect from a Java program. So please make sure that you do that. If you need to refresh your memory about any of the SQL that you need, I have on my blog here at the university a few pages that will give you some guidance in the SQL. It's not very difficult, and you certainly won't need terribly much for this module. Now, the concepts that you're going to need for this learning block evidently come from the previous learning block, and we'll be looking again at JavaServer Faces because we want to make sure that our managed beans, which is one of the other things from last week, can interact with a database so that information that comes in from the user is then stored in the database. We'll also be reminding ourselves about the JSF lifecycle because all of our components that we write will have to fit into that lifecycle. So quickly, a review of the JSF lifecycle. Remember that the control servlet in JSF imposes this lifecycle. And what it will do when it receives a request is to build a component tree that represents the form data that has been sent on that request. It's going to do some stuff that I call magical, and I still will call magical this week, and will then transfer the values from those form data values into one or more managed beans. So that by the time it gets to the managed bean, we know that the data is valid. That's the magic. Then there will be some methods in that managed bean that will be invoked to process the data. When the processing has taken place, then the control servlet thinks about sending some response back to the browser, and that is done in reverse. So find out what view I'm about to send back to the browser, build a component tree of that view, populate the components of that tree using data from one or more managed bean, and then render the view back on the browser. So that's the round-trip life cycle. And so my question now is, where would you expect the database to be in such an environment? Would you have the database on the web browser, or would you have the database on the web server? Yes, of course, it's the web server. If you had 1,000 clients, they can't all 1,000 of them have a database. Wouldn't make sense. Of course, it has to be on the server, and therefore we need some kind of mechanism. So what we're going to do is put the database on the web server. So here we have a simple request, a simple example. You can see that you can just about see, please enter your name and a text box. So there's an input text field in the XHTML. And when the submit button is clicked, it's going to send a request for simpleexample.xhtml to the web server. The web server will invoke the control servlet. The control servlet will build the component tree. That component tree will consist of a form component, inside of which is, amongst other things, that text box component containing the value that's typed by the user. That goes into the component tree. Step 2 will be to create managed beans. We're going to populate the user managed bean using that name property. So the value that the user types in the input text field will get put into the name property of the user bean. Now, as it happens, the output view is also making use of that time utility bean that we looked at last week. And therefore, the web server, as well as creating a managed bean for the reception of that value, is also going to create the managed bean that will produce this time here. And having created those beans, it will then populate the name property of user with the value that came from the web browser. Then it's time to prepare the contents of view time. So that will mean building the component tree, taking the name value from the user property and the current time value from the time utility bean, put those into that component tree, and then use that component tree to render the view that you see at step 6 here. So that's the life cycle. Where would you expect the database to be accessed in this sequence of things? We've already said that the database is going to be on the web server, so we would not expect database access in steps 1 or 6. So steps 2, 3, 4 or 5, where would you expect the database to be accessed? When it's being populated, so step number 3. All right, so we can't really do it before populating the user bean, because until then we've got no guarantee that the data is valid. When step 3 takes place, the name property is given a value. It's then and only then that we know that the value is valid. So that's the appropriate place, it would seem, to access the database. So let's do that. To create an SQL table, we would need something like this. Create table user demo, and then in brackets, the fields. Now those fields, in this case only one, are defined first of all by the field name. That becomes the column in the table, its type and length. And to do that in NetBeans, we would need first to copy that, and then in NetBeans we can go to services. At the top here you can see databases, expand that, JavaDB. JavaDB is the database that comes with NetBeans. So you've got there a relational database that you can use, but it's only local to that computer. If you want to make use of a networked database, then you can make use of the Oracle database that's reserved for students. I'm going to show you how to do this on JavaDB, but it's a similar process for when you want to set up your Oracle account. If you were doing it with Oracle, you would expand drivers and then right-click on Oracle thing and connect using, and then put in your credentials as well as the URL of the database. For now, in JavaDB, I'm going to right-click and create database. I'm going to give the database a name. Let's call it gdmDemo with a username and a password confirmed. And you can see that the database location is defined here. If you want to change that, then click on properties and change the location. I'm not going to bother, and then click on OK. So I've got to remember two things. What did I call the database? That's going to become part of the URL. And what was the username and password? And you'll see that the database has now been created here. So if I expand that, well, we can see there's a fracture here in that little icon. That just shows that I haven't connected yet. So right click and connect. So now I can see the username that I created. In tables, there are nothing. So I'm going to right click and execute command. So I can now type any SQL command that I want, and it will execute on that database. Well, I copied that earlier, didn't I? So I can paste in the create table and then hit this execute or run SQL button, and it will connect to the database, and it has told me that execution has finished with no errors. So if I now go back to here, you can see that the table exists and it's got a single field called username. And if I right click on the table name and view data, that automatically does a select statement to extract all the rows and displays them here. And as we'd expect, it's empty. So what if I want to store the information? Well, I'm going to need to request the name of the user in my web page so that when it comes over to the control servlet can put it into a managed bean. In the managed bean, I'm going to store the user's name in the field of the managed bean, which is exactly the same as it was previously, and then store the user's name in the database. Well, that's new code. So let's go and have a look at that code. It's in the project in user, and you can see that in set name, I'm going to store the name in the database. When the property in the bean is set, store that in the database. I can use the parameter that's come through here. So store name in database is going to connect to the database in the way that was shown you in the previous videos. And then I'm using a prepared statement. I will describe a little bit later why, but a prepared statement does a couple of things. First of all, it allows us to set up a statement, an SQL statement, with placeholders for the actual data that I want to put into the database. So this bit is fixed, it's prepared, and that will, if I'm using this particular statement many times, then it will only be created once, and then it's parameterized. I can just drop in the parameters that I want for the next call to that statement. And having done that, I've got two placeholders, those are the question marks, and then I can set those by calling setString in this case, because I know they're of type string. If I know they're of type int, then I'll call setInt. And these set method have two parameters. First of all, the index of the placeholder. Now these are not 0-based like with an array, they are 1-based. So the first question mark has an index of 1, the second index is 2, and so on. So I'm saying here that I'm going to set string number 1 to name and string number 2 to postcode. Well, we'll worry about that a little bit later. And then call execute update, which will cause that SQL statement to be applied to the database that I'm connected to. The result will come back, because it's an update, it will tell me how many rows have been affected by that statement. Now with an insert, you'd expect it to be 1 row. And so we'd expect that variable rows to have the value 1 after that execution. And if I wanted to, I could check that, validate it, just make sure. Now let's say I've got 300 rows already inserted, and I do delete star from user demo. Then it's going to delete every single row. That means 300 rows have been affected, and so the value that comes back from that update will be the value 300. If there's an error, then I'm going to get either an SQL exception, or if it hasn't thrown an exception, I'll get the value 0 come back, because it might be a valid statement, but it doesn't affect anything. Now, because we could get an exception, then all of this is put into a try block and a catch block for SQL exception with some appropriate processing, which in this case is probably not terribly appropriate. Just do a screen dump, which your users will never want to see. So don't leave it like that, but for our development purposes, that's okay. So when we run it, it's going to connect to the database, execute that statement, and then finally, anything you open, please close. You don't want to leave open connections to the database. With some database environments, that means that you could eventually just end up with a whole load of open and unused database connections that will seriously degrade the performance of your database. If you open it, close it. You've opened a statement, close it. You've opened a connection, close it. Now, what if we want to put more than one piece of information into the database? Let's say we want to have a postcode as well as the username, in which case we'll need to adjust the database. So a copy of that code, come back into NetBeans. I'm going to modify the command I had before, which starts off by dropping the original table and then creating it again, but this time with 2 columns. That's executed with no errors, and it means then that on the simple example 1, as well as the username, I can request the postcode. That will be bound to a property in the user bean. So in that user bean, if we go and have a look at user 1, there's the set name, store in database, set postcode, setting that. And so what I'm going to do now is make use of the postcode that has now been set. Except when I run it, what I get is this problem. The username is inserted, but the postcode is null. Any thoughts as to why that should be? Think about the life cycle. When we set name, we set the name and store the name. Set the postcode, we haven't got a store postcode. So what would be a solution that we could employ here? I've used the existing method and I'm inserting the values 1, 2, which are username and postcode. So what's going wrong? Let's think about the life cycle. These 2 values are entered and then sent as the request. The control servlet will build the component tree, put those values, which is name and postcode, into the component tree, check them, they're okay, that's the magic bit, then store them in the user bean. That user bean is accessing the database when set name is called. And we were hoping that set postcode might already have been called, but it hasn't. And we have no guarantee about actually the order that they'll be called in. So we've got a problem. And the problem is that we are assuming in this method that both the name and the postcode will have values because the set methods, both set methods will already have been called. And that is a false assumption. What we need instead is a mechanism whereby we can overcome this problem. And the problem is, if set name is called before set postcode, then there's no value in postcode. And that's why it's ending up as null in our database. What we can do instead is to use an action method. And this is an important part of that life cycle. An action method is a method that is called when the submit button is clicked. But it's called only after all those other set methods have been called. So in the life cycle, the servlet, the control servlet, will build the component tree, put all the values in, then having validated them, will copy them into the managed bean using the set name, set postcode, set this, set that. And only when all of those bean properties have been populated with the set methods, then, and only then, will the action method be called. And that means that we can guarantee that when the action method executes, all those bean properties are up to date and valid. Now it's really easy to set up an action method. It's just an ordinary method that you want to execute, and you bind it to the command button in this way. So here you've got the command button in the XHTML. Type is submit, value, that's the text on the front, is in this case submit, and then action equals. Well, what we did last time was to have action equals and then the name of the XHTML file that we wanted to go to. So we're not doing that now. What we're actually doing is calling a method in that bean. So the user2 bean dot and then the method. That will make sure that all the set methods are called first and then this action method will be called. By the time we get to that, that's in user2. So let's open up user2. We know that those two set methods will have been called. Notice set name no longer is accessing the database. We don't want to access the database before all the values have been populated. So we take that database access out of the set methods and put it into this other method, which is an action method. And now that will work exactly as we want it to. We've learned an important thing about the life cycle, that those set methods for the properties are called before any action method is called. If those methods don't complete because there's an error somewhere, then the whole life cycle is aborted, and so that action method will never be called. Remember, this is all controlled by the control servlet, and it knows that if there's an exception occur, then it cannot proceed and therefore will abort the life cycle, re-render the original view with error messages. So the action method will only execute if all the set methods have completed successfully. Now the other thing to note is that this action method is returning a string, because if you remember what we had in the command button before was action equals and then the view to display next. Well, we've taken that out and put a method call in. So the method now must return a string that is the name of the view that must be displayed next. What will happen is that when this executes, it's going to connect to the database, update the database with an insertion, and when it's done all of that, return view time, which is the next XHTML facelet to display. Right, I'm just going to take you through an example here about, given a username, display the postcode. I'll leave you to look at the code in detail because it's all very simple code, and if you've watched those two previous videos, you should be able to work out what's going on. Here we have a query example. Enter a username, click the button Find Postcode, and then we'll expect the postcode to be displayed for that particular username. When we click Find Postcode, that's going to be a submit button. An action method is going to interrogate the database, connect to the database, use a select statement to retrieve postcode where username equals and then the value that's been passed in. I'll show you that bit of code very quickly. There's the Find Postcode action method. Here's the statement, select postcode from user demo where username equals the name. Now this is unprotected. I'm not using a prepared statement here. The reason being, I want to show you a technique called SQL injection, which you might have heard of. Amongst other things, it's what caused big problems for a couple of years ago now. I think it was a 15-year-old schoolboy hacked using a simple technique called SQL injection. I'll show you that in a minute. And that's because they've done something like this, where they have taken the parameter and just built it into the SQL command, knowing that, well, name has got to be a string, so I'll put single quotes either side of it, and left themselves wide open. So execute that, process the result set, which basically means let's get the postcode, put it into a string, and then I can return it so that it appears down here. Brilliant. Works perfectly. Unless you get some kind of user who thinks, I wonder if, and tries a bit of SQL injection. What we should have done is use the prepared statement, and this is why. Bear in mind that there were some single quotes around that embedded parameter value. I'm now going to try Graham single quote, or single quote A, single quote equals single quote A. Now you take that string and embed it in another string that's already got two single quotes, and you're going to end up with a statement that says select postcode from user demo where username equals Graham or A equals A. Now with an or, you only need one of those two to be true to get a true. Well, A equals A is always true. In other words, that will now select every single row from the table. And all of a sudden, we've got a whole list of postcodes. That gives us a bit of a clue. Now we can see that this site is vulnerable to SQL injection. Now let's try inserting some other stuff. And you don't need a very expert knowledge of SQL to be able to do this. And you can find out all kinds of stuff. And that's what happened to a lot of other companies. So we need to guard against that. SQL injection is not a thing we want, and it's really easy to do. Make use of a prepared statement, as I've already shown you. And the reason a prepared statement works is because it does not allow SQL injection. It's a simple but very effective technique for guarding against SQL injection. You don't want to leave yourself open to SQL injection. So use a prepared statement. By the time you've completed this learning block, which includes doing the exercises on the practical worksheet, then you should not only know how to connect to a relational database, but you should also be able to use a prepared statement to perform queries, inserts, updates, and deletion. Also display data that has come out of a database. Insert data that goes into a database, having come from a facelet, just in the way that we've shown you in this example, or these examples today. Also, know exactly where in your managed bean you should interact with the database, and where not to interact with the database.